back inside our tents. We didn't converse much. We made an effort to sleep. I recall thinking about how flimsy tents are, basically just a notion of shelter, while gazing at the mesh ceiling. I'm writing this as I remember it, because every time I recite it aloud, I catch myself attempting to make it seem neater and more dramatic. And it didn't feel like that. It seemed disorganized. It seemed like a series of routine choices that gradually ceased to describe the situation. I'm not sharing this to make fun of genuine beliefs or to disparage anyone's culture. I'm using the term that locals use to warn us in private, without making jokes or attempting to frighten one another. I'm sure you know what I mean if you're from Arizona. Just comprehend this if you're not. Thinking that the woods posed a risk, we ventured into the backcountry. We didn't search for a narrative. We set out to find some peaceful days away from our screens. We returned with something that, despite my best efforts, I still can't classify as poor luck or overactive imagination. We were 4 in number. Since none of us want our full names associated with this, I'll use first names. I was there. Luke is the type of friend that always has more medical equipment than he actually needs, since he knows what happens when you don't. There was Tessa, who is bluntly pragmatic, a geology nerd who observes features most people walk right past. And there was Aaron, who always has a camera with him and views travel documentation as an integral part of the trip rather than an add-on. We were experienced hikers. We weren't taking any drastic measures. It was an easy strategy. A multi-day trek in the high country of eastern Arizona, where the air is thinner, the nights are chilly despite the warm days, and the forest has the ability to absorb sound, giving you the impression that you have entered a different type of stillness. We took care to choose a path that would keep us on public property the entire time. We weren't attempting to be edgy or venture onto any inappropriate territory. In the Apache Sitgreaves region, we began close to a modest, inconspicuous trailhead. The type of location that has only a pull-off, a metal post with a trail number, and a few worn signs on a corkboard, instead of a large sign or tourist center. The journey was planned to take place from September 29 to October 2nd, 2025. 4 days of hiking back to the truck after 3 nights out. We left the family with a simple itinerary. Luke carried a printed map, a waterproof sleeve, and a satellite messenger. I had a printed weather forecast and a compass. Aaron was carrying extra batteries. Tessa had food that appears to have been designed rather than cooked. We followed the standard procedure, which is to do it in a dull manner. On September 29, we arrived at the trailhead late in the morning. The light was brilliant, but not harsh, and the sky was clear and high. It smelled like dust and sun-warmed pine needles, the kind of scent that causes you to inadvertently breathe more deeply. We snapped a picture of the location and the mile sign on the road, examined the truck again, and secured it. Carried out the small process you perform in order to later verify that you were where you claimed to be. After that, we went hiking. It was a typical first day. That contributes to the difficulty in explaining the remainder of this. We strolled and conversed until becoming silent as the beat takes hold. The sound of boots on dirt, creaking pack straps, water bottles clinking softly, and the occasional snap of a dead twig. In the meadows, we noticed a new elk sign and heard their faint bugle in the distance. It seemed early for the season, but it was yet possible. Above the tree line, we observed a hawk riding a thermal. We traversed a small creek that wasn't shown on the map. It was cold enough that the air above it seemed to be at a different temperature, yet shallow enough to walk on. We filtered water, ate, and continued around mid-afternoon. Our goal was to find a level area next to a larger drainage system that we had identified as dependable. We desired water. We desired a spotless campsite. Our goal was to do everything correctly. Around 6 p.m., we pitched up camp in a little stand of trees above the waterline before dusk. If you've done this, you are aware of the type of camping I mean. A patch of ground that's already been used. A few ancient fire scars and bare dirt. It's close enough that you can find it again, but far enough off the route that you don't feel like you're sleeping on pavement in the shadows. Our food was hung. Our tents were arranged roughly in a line. We separated the sleeping sections from the cooking area. We took the appropriate action. I want to make it clear that the first strange occurrence happened when it was still light, because it is important. This sound at midnight was not eerie. It was late in the afternoon. The sun remained in the sky. I was tying off the bear hang, while Aaron was down by the creek, cleaning a pot. Luke and Tessa were contrasting the drainage system's actual layout with the map. It was peaceful. Then we heard a voice coming from further down the creek. It wasn't yelling. There was no panic. It seemed like a regular chat between an out-of-sight person and a hiker around a bend. A steady, low voice belonged to a man. It moved in an odd way among the woods, appearing and disappearing as though the wind was pushing it. At first, none of us could distinguish words. There was laughter after that, brief, not happy, rather like someone chuckling to themselves. "Other campers," Luke remarked, looking up. After listening for a while, Tessa shook her head. "It's just one voice. If he's talking, who's he talking to?" Everybody stood motionless and listened. The voice ceased. There was no sound. Then there was a deliberate, piercing sound, like a rock striking another rock. I start to feel foolish when I describe it at this point. The voice returned, but this time it was closer, and seemed to have moved without the accompanying sound of footsteps. Not insurmountable. People are able to move silently. Sound can be deceiving. However, the time was off. It appeared as though someone had gone down the drainage system, and then unexpectedly appeared up close to the curve, without any interruption. Luke was called out for being Luke. He didn't scream. He simply said, "Hey, you down there," in a typical tone. No answer. "Did you guys hear?" asked Aaron as he emerged from the water. Then he paused because the voice resumed, sounding as though it was behind us, on the opposite side of the creek. At that moment, we all turned. Trees, dark undergrowth, the creek's soft hiss. Once more, the voice ceased. My arms' hairs stood up in a way that isn't quite terror, simply being aware. "All right, that's enough of that," Tessa remarked. We completed our camp setup. We had food. That's what you do when something doesn't fit, so we made jokes about it. You reduce its size in an attempt to make it fit. We convinced ourselves that it was either someone far away, whose voice echoed strangely via the drainage system, or someone in the trees, tampering with acoustics. We were in an area with curves and valleys, where sound and water may do strange things. That is accurate. I still think that's accurate. Simply put, I'm not convinced it clarifies what transpired afterward. We heard something moving around the camp's perimeter as the light began to fade after dinner. Footsteps are slow. Take caution. Not an elk, not a deer. You can hear the occasional hoof scuff as deer and elk travel in a light, fast beat. This sounded like someone testing the ground with their feet. Just beyond headlamp range, it made a half circle around us. Luke turned on his lamp and swept it. Only branches and trunks were grabbed by the beam. There are no eyes, no shape, just nothing. The footsteps ceased. We held off. No more noise. We completed the standard checklist. Trash packed, food hanging, nothing strongly smelling. We zipped up. We made ourselves at home. The breeze in the pines was soft, and the sound of the brook was steady and reassuring. If you have slept outside, you are aware of how quickly your body may unwind after a long day when your legs are exhausted. I quickly went to sleep. Luke was whispering my name when I woke up. Just my name, not aloud or in a panic. It sounded like he was right next to my head because he was so close. My sleeping pad squeaked as I sat up so quickly. I paid attention. Everything inside a tent sounds louder in the dark. I sounded like a stranger when I breathed. "Yeah," I replied. No response. Then I heard Luke speak my name once more from outside the tent. The same tempo and tone. Close. However, I could hear Luke moving inside his tent, which was a few feet away, as if he had just sat up. The sound of a zip was heard. Then I heard Luke's genuine voice, which was strained and low. "Did you just mention my name?" My brain was working on the max, so I didn't respond immediately. "Stop. Who's that?" exclaimed Aaron in the adjacent tent. Once more there was a whisper outside, but this time it wasn't my name. Tessa owned it. Tessa's tent creaked. Instead of sounding drowsy, her voice was tense. "No," she replied. "No, absolutely not." Luke unzipped his tent and turned on his headlamp, and I followed suit. The trees were flooded with light. Through the branches, the brook shimmered. Everything appeared just as it had a few hours before. But the world seemed to be standing still, and the shadows were deeper. Luke, I wanted to grab him and drag him back in as soon as he stepped outside in his socks, since that was the most foolish time for him to be outdoors in socks. He moved his light quickly and deliberately, as if he were cleaning a room. With boots on, Aaron emerged as well, carrying his trekking poles as if they were more than just poles. Tessa remained in her tent, but she unzipped and pointed her light outside. Nobody was visible to us. No footsteps were audible to us. No respiration was audible to us. Wind and waves were the only sounds. Then we heard a call that sounded like a coyote coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. Coyotes, however, don't produce very clear sounds. This was also too ideal. It felt practiced as it ascended and dropped. It tightened the back of my throat. "That's not right. Record that," muttered Aaron, who was not easily alarmed. He picked up his phone and pressed record. The small screen glowing in his hand was visible. Beyond the beams of our headlamps, the night engulfed everything. The call resumed, but it ended suddenly, as if someone had shut a door. Lights swept as we stood there for a long time. Nothing took place. Luke finally said, "Go back in. This is not what we're doing." We went back in. I recall repeatedly telling myself that it was an animal, that someone was playing tricks on us, that it was sound traveling, and that there was an explanation that didn't require anything that would make me feel foolish. I mean, I heard something sniffing close to my tent later, after midnight, after 12 o'clock in the morning. Just that gentle inhale-exhale rhythm, close enough for me to hear the moisture in it, without being loud or dramatic. Because that's what you do when you want to vanish. I held my breath. Slowly, the sniffing traveled around the tent wall. Then it came to a stop close to the entrance. A hand on the zip caught my attention. "That seems familiar to me. I understand your thoughts. I would also think that. However, I heard it, the little metal pull tab rubbing up against the teeth. The fabric's slight strain. It moved just a fraction of an inch before stopping, as though the person doing it realized it wouldn't open silently. My entire body became chilled. I stayed put. I remained silent. My fingers felt big and awkward as I reached for my headlamp. Once more, the zipper remained stationary. The sniffing stopped. I heard footsteps after a short while. Soft, cautious, then nothing. As usual, morning arrived. Clean and unconcerned. Everything appeared normal again in the light, which was almost offensive. We all appeared to have had a restless night. Luke had a clenched jaw. Tessa appeared to have spent too much time peering into the darkness, since her eyes were inflamed. Usually the one to lighten the situation with a joke, Aaron was quiet. We quickly swept the camp. I needed something substantial. Thus it was annoying that there were no visible prints near my tent. However, the ground was a mixture of hard-packed earth and pine needles. Additionally, tracks don't always appear unless someone walks on soft mud. However, close to the creek where the Luke crouched and pointed at the wet soil, there were human prints, not those of deer or elk. Toes were visible. The ball of the foot was visible. The fact that someone had been barefoot close to our camp throughout the night wasn't the only thing that made my stomach plummet. The size was the problem. The footprint was not the broad shape you would anticipate, but it was too long and too thin, like someone with exceptionally huge feet. The foot didn't exactly flex the way a human foot should, and the toes were spread in an incorrect manner. Luke looked up at us after comparing it to his own footwear. "Someone walked through here," he said in his bare feet. Tessa looked around the tree line, or that's what someone wanted us to believe. The track pattern shifted a few feet past the barefoot prints, and Aaron, crouching close by, whispered, "Look." The movement continued in that direction. The prints appeared to have hooves now, but the direction and pace remained the same. It resembles a blunt, split shape that is hefty and deeply compressed rather than a neat deer hoof. It appeared as though the person had chosen to transition to hoof in the same stride after walking barefoot. For a moment, none of us spoke. The quiet of the night was not the same as that. We were staring at something we could point to in the daytime. Luke got to his feet and used his jeans to clean his hands. "Okay," he responded in a controlled tone. "We're not staying 3 nights. We ate quickly, broke camp earlier than we should have, and started moving. The plan was to shorten the route and angle towards a different trail that would take us back out in 2 days instead of 3. No one argued, not even Tessa, who argues on principle. The trail that morning felt like the same trail, but our brains weren't the same. Every snapped twig made us look up. Every shadow between trees looked like a shape. We tried to keep a normal pace and not bunch up, but we stayed closer than usual. We deliberately talked about normal things, like work, family, and stupid internet drama, as if keeping our voices steady would keep the world steady too. Around late morning, we saw another set of tracks crossing the trail. More barefoot prints fresh enough that the edges were crisp. Luke looked at the map. Aaron left the route to take pictures of them. Tessa whispered, "If this is some stupid joke, I swear." And then we heard something that made all of us stop at once. A whistle. 2 notes. A specific little pattern Luke uses sometimes to get attention without yelling. Like when he's trying to get someone's eyes on a trail junction. His face went blank. "That was my whistle," he said. Aaron said, "Do it again." Luke didn't. He just stared into the trees. The whistle came again. Same 2 notes, same spacing, from somewhere ahead and off to the right. Tessa's voice went flat. "Okay, nope. Hey, no response," exclaimed Luke. We accelerated as the whistle reappeared, closer but still off to the right, as if it was traveling parallel to us and keeping up with our speed. We stopped for a while. The forest returned to its natural state, and we began to breathe again. Then, early in the afternoon, we rounded a bend and noticed a man standing in the trail by himself. He had no pack, no trekking poles, and no visible water bottle. He was dressed in jeans and a dark hoodie, which is not appropriate for a backcountry hike, especially if you're going to be walking all day. He stood with his hands at his sides, staring at us as if he had been waiting. Luke slowed first. The man added, "You're a long way out," and I felt my own pace shift without realizing it. Tessa stood behind Luke, which is also unusual for her, and Aaron raised his camera just enough to begin recording if he so desired. Luke did the courteous thing, saying, "Yeah, you okay? You out?" His voice was too calm, neither friendly nor confrontational, simply flat. "My group's behind me," the man murmured, tilting his head as if he was listening to something we couldn't hear. We glanced past him and saw that the trail behind him was deserted. Tessa inquired, "How far back?" The man's eyes moved to Tessa's face, and his mouth twitched, like he almost smiled, but didn't. "Not far," he said. Luke said, "Do you need water?" The man's gaze flicked to Luke's pack strap, to the satellite messenger clipped there, then back to Luke's eyes. "I'm all right," he responded. "You ought to keep going." Aaron, who does not like being told what to do by strangers, said, "We are." We tried to walk around him. The trail was narrow there, brushed tight on both sides. The man didn't move. He just watched us, Luke stopped a few feet away. Not close enough to be grabbed, but close enough to be heard. Luke said, "We're just going to pass." The man's eyes moved, and for a little moment, I swear, his pupils didn't catch light as they should. It was brief. It could have been shadow, or it could have been my brain looking for something to blame, but that's what I remember. Then, very softly, he whispered, "Luke." We hadn't spoken Luke's name, so he froze. Tessa asked, "How do you know his name?" The man simply stared at me and tilted his head once more, before uttering my name, in the same tone as if he had known me for years, without responding. Aaron murmured, "No," and my mouth went dry. Luke's tone became harsher. The man's mouth opened slightly, as if he was going to say something, and this is the part that still makes me sick. He made a sound that wasn't a word, as if he was trying to form the first syllable of something, but couldn't, as if his tongue didn't know where to go. He then closed his mouth once more and stared. Tessa then moved forward, not close, but the man took one slow step backward off the trail, not to let us pass, but backward into the brush, as if the trail didn't matter to him. He didn't turn his body, didn't step carefully like someone avoiding tripping, just slid back into the trees, still facing us, eyes on us. We walked past him quickly, not running, but also not walking normally, and I could feel that he was trying to force the moment. With my heart pounding in my neck, Aaron looked back once and saw that the man had vanished. There was no sound of leaves or branches breaking. We didn't talk for a while, and when we did, it was Luke. "That's not okay," he whispered in a low voice. "That's not normal." We continued to move, pausing only to swiftly eat and filter water, and ensuring that no one left by themselves. We kept our heads up, and the entire day felt like the forest was watching us through 1,000 tiny gaps between branches. On September 30th, before sunset, we arrived at a new campsite that was farther away from the water than we had intended, but on higher ground where visibility was better. There was a small, open area, not a meadow, but enough space that you could see shapes moving between trees, which we purposefully chose because we were trying to eliminate variables. We set up tents closely together, didn't build a fire, and ate cold food. Even though it meant moving away from the tents, we hung the food bag, because we still believed in doing things the right way. Aaron played back the recording from the day, the part where the man said our names. The audio caught it clearly as anything, our names spoken like someone reading off a list. And when we listened to it, something in the tone made my stomach turn. It wasn't just that he knew them, it was the way he said them, like he didn't understand what a name was for, only that it was a sound that triggered a reaction. Night returned, and we tried to establish rules. No one left their tent without waking the others. If we hear someone calling for help, we check with each other first. That last one felt terrible to say aloud, but we did it anyway. It took about an hour before the rules were put to the test. It began with footsteps, slowly circling, followed by a human cough. The kind of cough someone does when they're trying to get attention without yelling. And then, from just beyond the edge of the clearing, a voice said, "Tessa." Tessa's breath caught so loudly that I could hear it through the wall. "Tessa, come here," the voice said as it approached once more. It sounded like her mother. Luke and Aaron didn't know what her mother sounded like, but Tessa did, and I could tell by the way her entire body responded, the way the fabric of her tent moved as she sat up rigidly, as if she had been struck. Luke whispered, "Tessa, look at me," and we could see each other through the mesh, the thin walls, and the headlight glow. The voice outside murmured softly, "Baby, come here." But Tessa remained silent, staring at the tent door as if she could see through it. "I am unable to locate you." "That's not her," Tessa muttered, choking on a sound that was half sob, half chuckle. "Stay," Luke urged. "Remain inside the tent." The tone of the voice suddenly changed to one of anger. "Tessa, just her name, hard, like a command." The pace of the footsteps then increased. A run. too quick for a person to run through undergrowth in the dark without creating additional noise. It sounded like it was going purposefully, navigating between trees as if it had done so before, and knew where the open areas were. "I'm recording," Aaron declared. His phone started, and I heard it. His breathing became shallow, and I heard it. The voice then altered once more. Luke took possession of it. It said, "Hey, from outside my tent. Close. Be open. I require assistance." Luke was in his tent. His headlamp glow was visible to me. His swallowing was audible to me. "Open up," the voice outside repeated. My tent door's zipper shifted. Not very much. Testing, only a tiny scraping pull. I did the only thing my body would allow me to do. Just as the first night. I yelled. Not a single word, just a loud noise to break the tension. "Two," exclaimed Luke, and Aaron yelled something I can't recall. Tessa screamed, enraged and full-throated. The footsteps seemed to have disappeared into the trees as they ran off quickly before abruptly stopping. After that, we didn't sleep. The darkness felt worse than the possibility of dead lights, so we sat there with our headlamps on, squandering battery. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something else that gave me a different kind of chill. You couldn't hear the quiet laughter, because it sounded like someone laughing into their palm. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't even a joke. It resembled practice. The morning of October 1st was like waking up following a catastrophe you still don't fully comprehend. We were stiff, tired, and hungry in that hollow sense that comes with burning through calories under stress. We quickly packed up. Even if it took pushing longer than anticipated, we made the decision to walk out that day if we could. We became aware that something was lacking at that point. Luke had lost his satellite messenger. The day before, it had been fastened to his shoulder strap. Because we had viewed it as a lifeline, we were all able to recall it. The clip was now empty. Luke rummaged through his pack, looked in his pockets, examined the tent, and examined the surrounding area. Not a messenger. "You took it off," Aaron remarked. Luke gave a headshake. I had never seen him look so pale. "No," he replied. "No, I didn't." We looked around the clearing. The brush line was examined. We found nothing, despite the fact that none of us wanted to go into the trees. "It took it," Tessa remarked. "Who?" asked Aaron, but Tessa remained silent. She simply stared out at the trees as if she thought the bark would flash open eyes. We set out on a walk. I want to clarify something about fear that until that day I didn't fully get. There's the terror you experience in an instant, a sudden spike. And then there's the continual underlying hum of anxiety. It also modifies your way of thinking. The next hour becomes difficult for you to envision. Every time you make a decision, your mind automatically assumes the worst. It felt like that. We were moving like people in a dream where the rules weren't correct, but we weren't in a panic. We reached a section of trail at midday that ran along a crest and overlooked a large valley. The trees parted sufficiently to allow for long-range vision. It ought to have felt more secure. For roughly 5 minutes, it did. Then we noticed smoke emerging from somewhere below, initially appearing as a thin thread. Smoke from a campfire. Aaron came to a halt and raised his camera. "Other hikers," he added with optimism. Luke scowled. "No fire restrictions," he declared. "And it's windy," Tessa said. We argued. Maybe someone doesn't care. A part of us yearned for other people. A part of us wanted to stay away from strangers. Finally, we slowly slanted down towards it while remaining on course. In order to avoid frightening someone, we yelled out as soon as we came close. No response. We arrived at a little campground close to a drainage bend. A ring of fire, with fresh, still warm ash, was present. There were 4 places to sleep, as if someone had spread out cloths on the ground. But there were no tents, no packs, no food, and no people. The mere hint of a camp, as though someone had set it up as a scene, and then moved on. Aaron approached slowly. "This is strange," he remarked. Luke knelt, touched the ash, and then withdrew his hand. "Recent," he stated. Tessa looked at the ground and said, "Like this morning." "Where are the tracks?" she inquired. "That's the problem. Footprints should have been visible in the wet dirt close to the drainage. Even if the movement was dispersed, you ought to have noticed it. However, the earth appeared strangely clean, as though it had been brushed. Not flawlessly, not as if a broom had passed through, but rather as if something had been dragged over it to make the signs less noticeable." Then Aaron remarked, "Guys," with that edge in his voice once more. He was pointing at something that was suspended from a low branch close to the camp. Luke's satellite messenger was there. Like an offering, it hung from its clip as if it had been purposefully hung at eye level. Luke remained motionless as he gazed at it. His mouth parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but was unable to. Then he swiftly moved forward, picked it up, and examined it. The screen was illuminated. Luke had been cautious with power, and it had been out all night, so it didn't make sense that the battery indicator was nearly full. There was nothing in the message log. It was as if it had never been used, with no sent messages or unsuccessful attempts. Luke took a deep breath. "It reset," he remarked. "Or something," Tessa remarked. "Or it disliked being utilized." Before Luke got it, Aaron snapped pictures of it in the tree. He snapped pictures of the camp. He recorded the absence of tracks. He spoke softly, as if he were recording something for later, stating the date, October 1st, 2025, aloud, and the approximate time, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so that it would be recorded. Too quickly we departed that camp. None of us wanted to put it into words, so we didn't discuss what it meant. After a few hours, we arrived at an intersection that we had shown on the map. We then had two options: a longer path along higher ground with greater exposure and improved vision, or a shorter route that passes through a smaller canyon-like portion with thicker trees. In a typical situation, we would have saved energy by taking the shorter path. We decided on visibility that day. We ascended. The sun began to set. The sound of the forest, whispering in one long breath, was brought on by the increasing wind. Although we could see farther, I wasn't as comforted by the distance as I had anticipated. I felt diminished by it. I felt like I was being seen from more perspectives. We heard another voice as the dust settled in. It was Aaron's this time. We simply come up from behind us down the trail. It called out in Aaron's voice, "Aaron, hold on." Aaron whirled so quickly that he nearly fell. "I'm not that person." His voice faltered as he said. The call grew nearer once more. "Hold on." We didn't respond. We continued to move. We started to almost jog, breathing hard, packs bouncing. Without the sound of a real runner on the trail, the cry behind us matched our pace. It appeared to be coming from the air, and remained at the same distance as if it were fastened to us. After that, it paused, and for an instant there was just wind. Then we heard Luke whistle his tweet pattern from ahead of us, somewhere we could not yet see. Luke's expression contorted, as if the sound had actually heard him. "No," he replied. We came to a halt. In the last of the light, the four of us stood in the center of the route, and listened. Once more, the whistle sounded, as though it was in the trees, just off the trail to the left. "Don't," Tessa said to Luke. "Nobody moves." One of the branches creaked. Not just any wind creak, a change in weight. Something shifted between the trunks of the trees to the left. At first, I couldn't see it well. I noticed that there was no light where it should have been. I noticed a tall, too thin figure that moved low before rising. Aaron raised his camera, but the picture would have been worthless because his hands were shaking. Luke's headlamp turned on and sliced like a blade through the twilight. The illumination briefly illuminated eyes that were too far apart to be deer and too high off the ground to be coyotes. The shape ducked back, reflecting hard in yellow and white. The whistling reappeared, this time closer and mocking. "Run!" exclaimed Luke, and we did. We didn't just run, we rushed, as if we were aware that ankles can break out, and your plans are over if you break your ankle. However, we sprinted quickly, and we didn't stop until we came to a little level spot close to the hill crest, where the trees were so thin that nothing could approach without being noticed. We hurriedly set up camp there on rocky ground, which made it difficult to sleep because we didn't want to descend into thicker cover in the dark. The sky was becoming purple. The first stars were emerging. At that height, the cold quickly descended. Adrenaline was humming beneath our skin, and we were all breathing heavily and tightly. We didn't converse much. We ate so fast that we hardly tasted anything. Clinging to routine was the only thing preventing me from feeling as though the world was slipping away from normal. So I hung our meals despite the fact that it felt useless. Nothing got near enough to touch our tents that evening. It may seem like relief, but it wasn't. It was as though someone was observing from a distance. It seemed to have discovered that we were agitated and didn't require any pressure. However, we heard it out there. On the slope below, we heard steady, patient movement. There was a faint noise that sounded like someone humming to themselves. The sound of rocks clicking together was audible to us once. 3 evenly spaced taps were made by 2 stones. I dozed off for minutes at a time at one point throughout the night, when my body was so tired that it sought to sleep nevertheless. I heard my daughter's voice during one of those times of half-dreaming. That's not even something I want to type. The absence of my daughter makes me feel terrible. At home, she was secure. However, I could hear it clearly when she called her father the way she does now. It was also incorrect, because she was unable to make that sound on this journey. It wasn't the right time. It didn't fit the memory. Shaking, I sat up. It was dark in my tent. The wind was the only sound on the ridge. "Come here," a voice whispered gently, almost sweetly, from someplace outside the boundaries of our small camp. I felt spots when I pushed my palms to my eyes. "No," I muttered to myself without responding. I stayed put. On October 2nd, the morning dawned with a clear blue sky and a chill that penetrated my clothing. In almost complete quiet, we crammed in. We were all clinging to the tenuous resolve that arises when one decides that returning to the automobile is the primary objective. We had a long day, according to the map. We wanted daylight on our side, so we got started early, around 7 in the morning. I can't adequately describe the brutality of the hike out without sounding like a typical difficult hike. We were carrying worry like an extra pack, so even if the terrain wasn't technically challenging, everything felt heavier. My chest constricted each time the trail descended into denser trees. My mind lit up each time the wind changed and made a whispering sound. The man in the hoodie was not visible to us. Once more, we were unable to see distinct tracks. Small, intentional marks that had not before existed were what we did observe. A row of stones, set as if someone had done so on a fallen log. A new whitish strip of bark that appeared to have been marked peeled from a tree at shoulder height. There was a clean white deer skull on the trail side, facing the route as if it had been placed there as a sign. Tessa paused and gazed at the skull for a considerable amount of time. "This is a message," she finally murmured. "What message?" Luke inquired. Tessa's voice sounded lifeless, that it can wait, and that it is aware of our whereabouts. We continued to move. The forest began to seem somewhat natural again, until we eventually approached the trailhead, which should have been a few kilometers away. Squirrels, birdsong, and the sound of far-off road noise that you can't exactly identify, but can sense in your bones. I began to cautiously believe that we would survive with nothing worse than a few restless nights and a narrative we would tell in private. Next, we noticed the truck. The door on the driver's side was open. Without thinking, Luke started running, and I went after him. Aaron and Tessa trailed behind. From a distance, the cab appeared strange, as if something had been disturbed inside. Luke was the first to arrive at the vehicle and froze. The interior had been tampered with. It had been reorganized rather than ransacked in a desperate manner. The center console lights up, the glove box opened, and paper was strewn all over the seat. On the dashboard was Luke's extra headlight that he had left in the vehicle. With its lifeless beam aimed at the windscreen, it turned on like someone had desired for it to be radiant. There was a print in a thin layer of dust on the truck's hood. Just one impression. It had the appearance of a hoof, but it was hefty, blunt, and unclean. Aaron snapped a picture. "That's not an elk," he remarked, his voice trembling. I could see Luke struggling to decide whether to laugh or throw up as he stood there looking. With her hands clenched, Tessa slid into the passenger seat and looked around the cab. "Check the back," she added. Everything was examined. There was nobody present. It was nearly made worse by the fact that nothing significant was taken. We still had the satellite messenger. We still had our packs on our backs. Luke turned the key, and the vehicle came to life. As if that mattered, we entered and locked the doors. Aaron became motionless as we drove away, staring out the rear window. He said, "Stop." Luke decelerated. "What?" Aaron gestured. There was a tall, thin form standing motionless at the edge of the tree line, close to the trailhead, where the trees met the dirt pull-off. It was just observing, not waving or moving. Details were difficult to notice, due to the distance and the dust and heat shimmer. I couldn't see a face. All I could see was posture. Straight, very stiff, like someone attempting to remain still. Then it moved while we watched. For a brief moment, the shape resembled an animal on all fours as it descended quickly and low. Nor a bear, nor a deer. Something with an odd, effective motion. After that, it disappeared into the trees. Luke was the driver. He remained silent for a considerable amount of time. None of us did. The road seemed too open and too light. My body recoiled each time we passed another car, as if it anticipated a mishap. I was a little relieved when we eventually came to a section of roadway with actual traffic. Aaron sent the audio and pictures to a shared folder that evening when he got home. We had to go over everything like investigators. We had to either figure out the typical answer or demonstrate that we weren't going insane. Not all of the files were corrupted, but some were. There are enough of them to be annoying. The voices could be heard, but there were weird clips in the audio, such as a half-second pause before the tape began. The majority of the footage of the eyes shining at sunset was a wobbly blur, but Aaron managed to capture one clip in which a pale object that appears to be too tall and too thin to be an elk can be seen between two trees. I'm not attempting to persuade you that a Wendigo exists. I'm attempting to explain why just 4 of us drove back out of the woods after 5 regular adults spent a long weekend there, and why the 4 of us no longer discuss hunger in the same manner. We weren't careless individuals. We weren't intoxicated. We weren't there to record a stunt or call forth anything. We were so exhausted that we decided to go on a cabin getaway. That's the real explanation. For months, there had been a lot of work. It's the kind of heavy that causes you to lose track of time and stare at walls. Jordan had just returned from a difficult period in the hospital. Kyle hadn't slept well in a year and had a baby at home. Nina was living off of deadlines and caffeine throughout her final semester. Ben. At the time it seemed like Ben needed a vacation more than the rest of us. But he was the one who pushed for it the hardest, which should have told me something. His uncle had a friend who had a cabin in the backcountry that wasn't a typical rental. A phone call, a handshake, money in an envelope, no app, no reviews. Situated on the edge of a vast expanse of public property was the cabin. Bogs, old logging cuts, mixed woodland, and miles of nothing in all directions, and it was more empty than normal in late autumn. Harold, the person who observed it, used it as a base for checking and trapping lines over the winter. He allowed anyone to use it, as long as they knew that remote meant remote, didn't make noise, and didn't leave rubbish behind. On a Thursday morning, we met at my house before the sun came up. Jordan's truck, my SUV, and the equipment. Despite Harold's assurances to Ben that there would be a woodpile, we had food for 4 days, plus extra, a small generator, propane, a 2-burner stove, a cooler, and a tote of firewood kindling. We had headlamps with extra batteries, a first aid kit, a battery jump pack, and a satellite messenger that Kyle took because his wife wouldn't let him leave without it. We had a shotgun and 2 rifles. It was the woods, and Harold's property line backed up to an area where bears didn't read calendars. Not because we were hunting a monster. The drive was long, level, and unremarkable until it wasn't. When you enter a new type of area, you can sense it. Tires on asphalt, then tires on gravel, then tires on rutted soil that was once maintained but was now mostly a suggestion, were the only things left after cell service, radio, and even the sound of traffic subsided. For fuel and last-minute groceries, we made a stop at a tiny town. At that point, the first event occurred that I could have heard but chose not to. Ben asked the cashier, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a bun, whether she knew Harold when he walked inside to pay at the petrol station. The woman's expression shifted. There was only a slight tightening around her eyes, as if she had heard a name from a section of her life she didn't enjoy going to. She wasn't astonished or perplexed. She claimed to know him. Ben announced that we were going to the cabin. We weren't told not to go by the woman. She refrained from using the dramatic warning that is typically seen in films. "Are you going to be out there after dark?" was all she asked. "That's kind of the point," Ben remarked, chuckling a little. The woman appeared to be checking the time without a clock as she peered past Ben out the window at the tree line. Then she calmly advised, "Don't answer if you hear someone calling your name. Don't respond, regardless of whether it sounds like someone you know." Ben grinned and said, "Okay." The woman moved the receipt towards him with her fingertips, as if she didn't want to, just like she had advised him not to pet a dog. Make contact with him. And don't get cute about the old stories, she added. Those are not said for amusement by people in this area. When Ben returned, he told it to us as if it were a humorous local superstition. Kyle chuckled. No, she rolled her eyes. Jordan didn't argue, but he also didn't laugh. I recalled Jordan staring at Ben for a moment longer than the others, as if he was attempting to determine if Ben was acting or joking. Later on, that appearance matters. At the end of the well-maintained road, we ran across Harold. It wasn't the kind of gate found on private land. It was merely a gap in the undergrowth, where an older trail continued into the woods. There are 2 strips of level ground, with grass in the middle. When we got there, Harold was standing outside his old, battered truck, as if he had been there for some time. He was in his late 60s, slender, and had hands that appeared to be permanently discolored by labor. He was not really happy. He asked if we had everything we needed after shaking hands. Ben gave the envelope to him. Harold failed to count it. Like he had already determined whether it was proper or wrong, he just tucked it under his jacket. Harold then said something else that, looking back, ought to have been a warning. "Don't chase sounds if you get turned around," he added. "Remain where you are, and use the messenger if you hear anything. If you believe someone is lost, don't venture into the trees." When he stated it, he looked directly at each of us, as if he wanted it to stick. His tone was not eerie as he continued, "People die that way." It seemed bland, as if he were stating that heart attacks and falls are the main causes of death, which is accurate. "We have the satellite messenger," Kyle informed him. Harold gave a nod. He wanted to know if we had ever used it. "Yes," Kyle replied. "Good," Harold remarked. "Don't feel arrogant." He then instructed us to follow the track for just under 7 kilometers till the 3rd bifurcation. Next, pick up the right fork and continue till we come across the orange paint on the trees. "You went too far if you see blue paint," he remarked. He claimed that the cabin was situated close to a tiny lake that resembled a large pond. "Water looks close," he remarked, "but unless you boil it, don't drink it." He did not go into detail. He was not required to. With both cars slowly bouncing through ruts and branches raking the sides, we entered. The type of driving where you are constantly focused on the ground and are unable to take in the landscape. The forest grew denser. The sky darkened. We opened the windows at some point along the route, since the temperature had plummeted to the point where our breath was visible. The track widened after narrowing, and the orange paint was there, shining like a wound on the bark, when we struck the third fork. We went deeper with the right fork. By the time we arrived to the cabin, the day had taken on that late autumnal gloom that makes it seem like nightfall even at noon. The cabin itself fulfilled Harold's promise without turning it into something it wasn't. That's the best way I can explain it. It might have been a boot print warped by freezing and thawing. It might have been nothing at all. Jordan took a long moment to look at the ground. "We're not hanging around this," he continued. "Leave it alone." Yes, we did. We entered. The cabin smelt of pine and stale smoke. A table, a shelf containing some ancient-looking canned items, a small wood burner with a blackened kettle on top, and 2 bunks built into one wall were all present. I also didn't anticipate certain things: a hand-crank radio, a metal box beneath the table, a stack of notebooks, and a small laminated sheet with block letters and a list of regulations taped to the wall close to the door. They weren't rules for ghosts. They were sensible backcountry guidelines. Make sure the door is locked. Food should never be left outside. Boots should be kept indoors at night to prevent freezing. Avoid going outside with a headlamp and searching for eyes if you hear animals. Make use of the horn. A tiny air trumpet was mounted on a nail near the door. However, there was a line at the bottom of the sheet that appeared to have been written later and was written in a distinct handwriting style using darker ink. "Don't return the whistle." That bit made me laugh, since that's what people do when they're uncomfortable. Ben grinned, as if he had been anticipating it. Jordan didn't smile, as Kyle said, "Okay, that's creepy." As if to acknowledge it, he reached up and tapped the page with one finger. He then resumed his unpacking. We started the fire, prepared an early dinner, and fell into the rhythm that individuals experience when the outer world fades. We engaged in a card game. We shared tales. We had a small amount of alcohol. After carrying equipment and inhaling chilly air, we were exhausted. When the wind started to build up around 9, the lake began to groan slightly as the ice moved at the margins. This sound is natural, but if you haven't heard it before, it's still unnerving. The first sound came that evening. I heard something outside, while I was half asleep in the higher bunk, listening to the cooker tick and snap as it cooled. The cabin wasn't directly adjacent to it. Between the cabin and the lake, it was farther away, close to the tree line. It sounded like footsteps on frozen leaves. Take slow steps. Quit. Take slow steps. I listened while holding my breath. Then I heard my name. It was obvious enough that my body responded before my mind. It said, "Matt." But it wasn't yelled or muttered. Rather, it sounded like someone calling from outside because they didn't want to knock. My head struck the ceiling beam when I sat up so quickly. By the time I realized what was going on, my heart was already pounding. I didn't respond. All I did was listen. It repeated my name. The same distance, the same tone. Ben moved on the bunk beneath me. As if he were going to answer, I heard him take a breath. Jordan said, "Don't," in a sharp, low voice in the darkness. After a moment, Na's faint, tremulous voice came from the other bunk. "Did someone just tell you to keep quiet?" Jordan remarked. There was movement in the footsteps. It was moving sideways, not closer, as if it was strolling along the edge of the trees in quest of a better view. After that, It stopped, and we didn't hear anything for so long that my brain attempted to classify it as a dream. That was unbelievable to my body. My body remained awake and hot. Kyle grabbed the satellite messenger and examined it as if it were a weapon. Even though the screen was dull, I could see the small indicator, indicating that the battery was still in good condition. We didn't want to be the ones to call for assistance due to a disturbance. Ben muttered, "It sounded like you," after a few more minutes. I murmured back, "It sounded like someone was calling my name." Even at that time, I valued that distinction because if I had acknowledged that it sounded like a person I knew, it would have become real in a way I wasn't prepared for. Even though we had shut the door, Jordan stood up and discreetly examined the latch. He looked out the window, but at night, all you can see is what your eyes perceive. The door was not opened by him. He refrained from acting like a brave fool. "It's an animal, or someone playing around," he added, as he took a seat again. "No one leaves in any case." Eventually, we fell asleep in fits. The woods were typical in the morning. They were gray, cold, and peaceful, the kind of peace that feels like a blanket. When we went outdoors, we discovered footprints all around the cabin. Not a planned horror scene with a flawless series of prints leading up to the door. Merely proof of motion, indentations. There were scuffed areas next to the woodpile, disturbed leaf litter in the frost, and a line of impressions that began close to the lake and wrapped around the cabin before vanishing into heavier vegetation. Jordan knelt down and gazed at one of the more distinct impressions. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was not a boot print. Instead was not shaped like a human foot, but instead resembled a long, narrow foot with a heel and toes. Overly unequal, overly stretched. Kyle attempted to make a joke. Harold might have stopped by to see how we were doing. Jordan did not raise his head. Harold would have pulled up and knocked. Na used her phone to record the tracks, primarily to convince herself that they were authentic. While Ben was studying the TV behind her, I noticed something that didn't sit well with me. Not frightened, not perplexed. Content, like a human observing the sign they had been looking for. Because that's what your brain does when it wants normal. We spent the day performing typical cabin activities. We took care to stay in sight of the cabin for as long as possible, as we hiked a small circuit around the lake. We collected additional timber. Na learned how to correctly split kindling from Jordan. Lunch was prepared by Kyle, and we discussed our jobs, our families, and the ridiculous things we had been too anxious to laugh about at home. Even so, there was something a little strange about it, as if the trees were waiting. We discovered the first significant twist by mid-afternoon. Those notebooks in the metal box were the source of it. In the sense of poetry, they weren't journals. They were the type of writing that people make when they need to keep records in order to survive, such as logs, dates, weather, trapping notes, and ice thickness. It was years old, for the most part. The penmanship then altered in the most current notebook. The previous entries were well organized. Later ones were jagged and cramped, as if the writer was chilly or their hands trembled. I began turning pages and reading aloud passages that didn't feel intrusive. Basic information on repairs and storms. I then covered up an entry that caused my throat to dry up. It talked about hearing names, voices, and calls coming from the lake outside the cabin. According to the author, he remained indoors and did not respond. He claimed to have heard whistling. He claimed to have seen something in the tree line that was too thin, too tall, and did not move like a human. "It wears hunger like a coat," he stated in simple terms. I put down my book. I didn't want to give it authority by saying it aloud. Ben leaned in. "Keep going," he whispered. Jordan extended his hand and used it to shut the notepad. "No," he responded. "We don't have to give that to our brains." Ben's expression hardened. "It's merely a man's notes." Jordan gave him a look. If we read it the following week, it will still be a guy's notes. We concentrate on what we can control at the moment. Surprisingly, Kyle supported Jordan. We came here to rest, he remarked. Let's avoid making this into something. No, I didn't argue. She appeared pallid. I wish we had left back then. I wish I could say that after reading the notebook, we became alarmed and made the wise decision. We didn't. The daylight was still fine, so we stayed. Since leaving would have required us to acknowledge that we were afraid of handwriting in a notebook, we didn't want to waste the trip. We remained, and the woods drew nearer that evening. The radio was where it all began. Kyle had brought a little portable speaker, but it was worthless because there was no service. However, the cabin's hand-crank radio was still operational. After turning it on for a bit, Kyle experienced static. Then there was a voice, faint and tremulous, but a voice. Since it was something outside of ourselves, we all leaned in like children around a campfire. Neither a weather station nor a dispatcher sounded like the voice. It sounded like a man speaking softly into a microphone. At first, we were unable to read the text. After a few moments of silence, we clearly heard, "Don't answer." Kyle's eyes widened, as if he had received a slap. Static was the shift in the signal. The same low voice reappeared, closer this time, as if the radio had tuned in. "If you hear static, your name, static, do not." Jordan grabbed the radio and turned it off. That time, nobody laughed. 5 adults in a cabin sat there, gazing at a dead radio as if it had crawled into the space. I recall the faint noises, the crackling of the stove, and Kyle's unconscious claws tapping the satellite messenger. No, Ben was swallowing hard and breathing slowly through his nose as if he was trying not to smile. Ben was the one who broke the silence. "My grandma used to talk about it," he continued. Jordan remained silent. Still, Ben went on. "It's not a ghost story. Rather, it's a warning that hunger might transform into a walking creature." Kyle spoke cautiously. "Your grandmother was a native." Ben paused. "No, but she was raised among those who were." At last, Jordan said something. "We will not engage in mythology." Ben's eyes flickered. "If it says your name, it's not folklore." Jordan got to his feet. Matt's name appeared. That might be anything. A bird, an echo, and someone playing. However, we will frighten ourselves into making mistakes if we sit here discussing monsters. That ought to have put an end to it. Ben refused to let it end. Therefore, it didn't. He responded, "What if it wants us to make mistakes?" I was struck by that line, not because it was insightful, but rather because it was the first time someone in the room expressed aloud how we all felt. That is, that dread was a part of it. That night, the wind surged once more. The cabin made a creaking sound. The lake moaned. The whistling began at midnight. It was not directly in front of the door. Once more, it was drifting in on the wind along the lake. 3 notes are repeated in a straightforward melody, as if someone were practicing. Na sat straight upright in the dark, because it sounded enough human. She muttered, "Is that you?" No one responded. The whistling stopped. Then it began once more, a bit nearer. Jordan waited at the door without opening it, after getting up and grabbing the air horn. He didn't appear valiant. He appeared worn out and irate, like a man handling a risky and foolish situation at the same time. Then we heard Ben's voice, right outside the window. "Hey," it said nonchalantly, as if he were returning to a room after answering a phone call. "Open up," I said, locking every muscle in my body. Ben was in the bunk underneath me. His respiration was audible to me. His garment had a subtle soap odor that I could detect. His voice could not have been outside the window. "Ben," Kyle muttered, but Ben remained silent. "Not initially. Come on, it's freezing, let me in," shouted Ben's voice, outside the window. Jordan blew the air horn, headed for the window and blew it without thinking. In the tiny cabin the noise was harsh, Na covered her ears and gave a yell. My eyes began to water. Like a siren, the air horn reverberated off the walls. There was a scramble outside. Quick motion through frozen foliage, followed by quiet. Jordan held the horn for a considerable amount of time. After that, we didn't sleep. As if that were the only thing we trusted, we waited for dawn while sitting in the stove's low light. We discovered something at the door when daylight arrived. A piece of cloth caught on the latch as if it had been tugged firmly. The color was red flannel. Kyle slowly turned it over while holding it up. It seemed as though it had been ripped. The fabric was faded and aged. Ben's expression became expressionless. Harold said, "That's his." We all gazed at him. Ben took a swallow. Yesterday, Harold was dressed in a red flannel. Jordan claimed he didn't accompany us. Ben seemed to be trying to get rid of the vision by shaking his head. No, but he could have checked during the night. Perhaps the latch caught him. Kyle responded, "Why would Harold come out here at night and not knock?" Ben had no response. He simply gazed at the piece of cloth, as if it were a puzzle piece that didn't appeal to him. That morning, we discovered more tracks, and the harder frost made them more visible. They tightened their circle around the cabin, as if whatever had been outside had repeatedly walked the perimeter, testing. Again, some tracks were thin impressions that had been stretched. "Okay, let's go," he said after that. We quickly packed. That's another important detail. We didn't follow the leisurely, cautious pack that individuals do when they're at ease. We filled containers with our belongings. It didn't fit, so we left some food behind. The notebooks were left behind. The cards were left behind. Jordan wouldn't allow us to be the type of people that left a mess, so we ended up leaving the cabin cleaner than when we arrived. Even so, I saw him swiftly sweep the floor while clenching his jaw, as if sweeping prevented his hands from trembling. After getting outside, we loaded and started both cars. My SUV started smoothly. Jordan's truck fired up smoothly. For the first time in hours, Kyle's expression relaxed. Na got into my passenger seat and tightened her seatbelt, like she was grounding herself in reality. Ben stood by Jordan's truck, staring back at the cabin on the lake, with one hand on the door. He appeared to be listening for something that no one else could hear. "Get in," Jordan yelled. Ben entered. Due to the narrow track, we initially pulled off slowly. My stomach turned when the cabin disappeared behind the trees more quickly than I had anticipated. I wanted to be able to see it. I wanted evidence that we were moving on from it. Before we encountered the first issue, we traveled for around 5 minutes. There was a large tree down across the track. It had a thick, massive trunk that was difficult to shove away. The green wood of the new brake was visible where it had snapped. It appeared to have been placed there since it lay across both tire paths. Kyle stepped out and approached it. He made contact with the bare wood. "This is fresh," he remarked. "This just happened." Jordan also left. Nana remained in the SUV with wide eyes as I did. Slower than the others, Ben emerged last. "We can move it," Jordan remarked. Kyle glanced up at the canopy. "How did this fall? There isn't a storm." Jordan remained silent. He simply took a little saw from the back of his truck. We heard the voice once again at that point. Not near, not behind us. Beyond the fallen tree, further along the track ahead. It wasn't just a generic woman's voice. It sounded like Kyle's wife. It spoke Kyle's name in the manner of an agitated spouse, and anxious at the same time. It called, "Kyle, you're where?" Kyle froze, as if a switch had been flipped. I saw his expression shift, as his entire body stiffened. Fear, bewilderment, and then something worse. I hope. Jordan lost his temper. "No, Kyle," Kyle muttered. Jordan moved ahead of him at that point. "It isn't." Once more the voice called, the same tempo and tone. Instead of coming from the track, it sounded like it was coming from the trees. like a person standing in the middle of the trunks. Before he caught himself, Kyle took a single step forward. I saw him resist his own desires. The strength of that draw is difficult to describe. The rest of your mind disappears if you think it's your person out there. No, someone inside the SUV said, "Kyle, don't." Kyle gently moved his head in the direction of the SUV, as if he needed to see her face in order to recollect reality. "It knows," Ben said. Jordan's gaze was filled with accusation and rage as he gazed at Ben. "Stop," Jordan commanded. "Stop feeding it." Ben didn't argue, but he also didn't appear embarrassed. Nevertheless, we worked on the tree. Jordan used a saw. Kyle was helpful. I pulled branches. Our hands were cold, and we all stopped to listen every few minutes, so it took longer than it should have. There was no more call from the voice. When we were at work, in a way that silence was worse. It was akin to patience. We angled the cars into the undergrowth to create enough room to avoid the trunk. Tires crunching on dead limbs, Jordan drove his pickup through first. My SUV trailed behind. We returned to the track and accelerated. The second twist came at that point, the one that, when I watch it again, still makes me feel nauseous. Ben began to transform. Not in the manner of a movie, not with antlers growing or anything. We didn't notice it until it was deep, since it was more subdued. Ben had always been the group's most ravenous member. The friend who ate additional food while driving after placing an order, just in case. After traveling and chopping wood, it didn't seem odd that he had eaten more than everybody else at the cabin. However, as soon as they were in the cars, he began inquiring about food once more. Then stated over the radio between the cars, "We ought to pull over and eat something." Jordan snapped back, "We're not stopping." "I'm shaking," Ben remarked. "Sugar is what I need." "Eat a bar in the truck," Jordan said. Ben's voice returned with more clarity. My suitcase was left in the cabin. Jordan remained silent for a moment, and during that time, I sensed the decision taking shape like a storm cloud. Jordan was the type of person who disliked abandoning tasks. He would never have considered looking back for a bag. The possibility that one of us might develop a health problem as a result of our inability to quit, unthinkable too. Kyle's voice became strained. "I have some snacks. At the next pull-off, I'll toss them to you." Jordan lost his temper. "Don't pull off. We continue to move." Ben's voice became softer. "You're behaving as though someone is after us." Jordan remained silent, but it was a response. After 20 more minutes of driving, the track split. One branch appeared to have been used more than the other. Harold instructed us to use the more worn one in order to exit. Jordan didn't slow down. My SUV trailed behind. The route ended in a clearing a mile later that wasn't shown on any map I had seen. It wasn't an organic clearing. There were stumps, old logging detritus, and a rusty piece of equipment that had been partially engulfed by vegetation. Jordan came to a firm stop. I came to a halt behind him. Kyle went on the air. "This is incorrect." After we got out, the woods behind us began to stir, to which Jordan said, "I know." I can only phrase it that way. The distance between the trees, not the trees themselves. It was as if a tall creature moved between shadows. Na took hold of my sleeve with such force that it was painful. Jordan held up his rifle like a statement, not really aiming it at anything. With the satellite messenger in his hand and his thumb resting on the SOS cover, Kyle stood by his truck, with his gaze locked on the tree line, then moved a few feet into the clearing. He was breathing quickly, but his expression was composed, despite the circumstances. Serene, like resignation or similar acknowledgement. "Ben," warned Jordan. Ben murmured softly, not looking at him. "It's been here the whole time." Jordan moved in his direction. "Get back to the truck." Ben gently turned his head, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His eyes were darker, not in color, but in focus, as if he was looking past Jordan at something behind him. "We should have listened," he added. Jordan's voice hardened. Ben retreated a step at this point, and then a different voice emerged from the forest. It wasn't one of ours this time. The voice sounded faint and raspy, that of an elderly guy. It screamed out, "Help, please!" Kyle instantly responded, moving in its direction. Jordan pulled him back by grabbing his jacket. "No," Jordan growled. The elder man's voice sounded painful as it sobbed. "I'm wounded. I am unable to." Na began to sob softly, not because she thought it was true, but rather because it is heartbreaking to hear a human voice pleading like that. Jordan lifted the air horn he had stored in the cabin. When we departed, he stuffed it into his coat pocket and fired it in the direction of the trees. The clearing was ripped apart by the boom. Like someone had severed a cable, the voice abruptly stopped pleading. Then a new sound was heard. A moist, low breath, like something breathing through an improperly formed mouth. I noticed it when I looked. Not completely, not in sharp-edged daylight. I had had enough. It stood tall. I've never stood next to someone so tall. It was thin in a way that didn't seem appropriate for a moving object. If you could call them arms, they were too lengthy. It had small shoulders. It seemed to always be leaning in your direction as its head sat forward. The worst aspect was that, although it didn't look like a costume in a way that shouldn't exist, I couldn't determine where the animal ended and the person began. We weren't charged. It was silent. It simply stood watching, somewhat obscured by the trees. Additionally, the dead leaves beneath it did not crunch as they should have when it changed its weight. For its size, it moved too softly. Jordan fired a loud punctuation shot into the earth in front of it, not at it, but as a warning. The roar reverberated off the trees and shattered into the atmosphere. It didn't recoil. Ben let out a single hilarious laugh. "It doesn't care," he continued. Jordan slung the weapon in his direction. "Now get in the truck." A beep came from Kyle's satellite messenger, warning about a cold-related battery. In an attempt to warm it, he slapped it on his hand. Jordan bolted for his pickup. Kyle bolted back to his. I dragged Na over to my SUV. Ben remained in the area for a moment longer, gazing into the woods as if he were listening to something personal. Ben then turned and sprinted towards the trees rather than a car. I yelled, "Ben!" Jordan called his name as well, but Ben didn't slow down. Like he was engulfed by the jungle, he disappeared between the trunks. Jordan began to pursue him. Kyle firmly grasped Jordan's arm. "No," Kyle uttered in a broken voice. "No, that's what it wants. Jordan has fiery eyes." "That's my friend," Kyle declared. Jordan paused before saying, "And you'll die." It was a terrible hesitation, the type that haunts a person forever. Jordan then slammed the door of his truck and entered. "Get in," he yelled at me from his window. Na was pushed into the passenger seat by me. Her teeth clicked as she trembled so violently. I took the wheel. Already in his truck, Kyle was maneuvering it into the narrow clearing. The correct track was nowhere to be found. All we knew was that we had to leave. At the edge of the clearing, where the ground appeared least inclined to engulf us, Jordan fired up his truck and crashed through the undergrowth. It was our only option, but it was also risky. Kyle trailed behind. I went with them. My SUV is bucking over roots and stumps. My hands were white on the steering wheel. Ben screamed from the trees behind us. Nor a long scream, nor a scream from the film. Abrupt cutoff sounds like someone who is unable to comprehend what they are seeing up close. Na sounded as though she was choking. I noticed movement near the clearing's edge in my rearview mirror. It moved too quickly for something so slender. Then it was engulfed by the woods. For what seemed like hours, but was actually just a few minutes, we drove blind. The woodland turned into a jumble of dead ferns and trunks. The vehicle's sides were scratched by branches. Jordan managed to keep his vehicle running, even after it fishtailed and almost got stuck in a ditch. Eventually, by chance or accident, we came upon an earlier logging road that was more well-established and had space to drive. Jordan continued. He simply turned it on and pumped petrol. Kyle's pickup continued to follow closely. Kyle was closely followed by my SUV. We continued driving until the trail broadened and the woods thinned, at which point we returned to the well-maintained gravel. Jordan didn't slow down till then, and even he continued after that. He continued driving till we arrived at the location where we had first encountered Harold. The brushes break. The boundary of civilization. Harold wasn't there, but his truck was. He had his driver's door open. The light inside was on. The dirt that led off the road and into the trees had drag marks. Before the cars completely stopped, Jordan slammed his brakes and leaped out. "Jordan, no!" yelled Kyle. Jordan went to the drag marks, ignoring him. My legs were acting strangely, so I also got out. Na sobbed while remaining in the SUV. Attempting to reheat the satellite messenger in his hands, Kyle emerged. Jordan followed the drag marks into the trees for about 20 feet before coming to a complete halt. He gazed at something on the floor. I saw what he saw when I caught up. Harold's crimson flannel was ripped and twisted as if it had been wrenched off. There was a set of those long, narrow marks in the soil next to it, and it was now evident that they weren't boots. Jordan was shivering and gasping as he stood there, and then he did something that devastated me. "I'm sorry, not to Harold, to Ben," he said in a quiet voice. Kyle approached from behind. He opened the satellite messenger's SOS cover and depressed the button. The gadget beeped weakly, as if it were worn out. Kyle gazed at the screen until the sending icon showed up. "You can check that part. The device log contains a timestamp. The rescue call is documented. GPS coordinates are available." Even though everything seemed surreal, that's how I know we were precisely where we believed we were. Hours later, search and rescue arrived. Real motors, real clothes, and real people. We did what worried people do when they inquired what had happened. We offered them a rationalized version. We reported seeing a big animal. Ben ran, we said. We claimed to have been turned around. Harold may have been attacked, we said. We didn't claim that it mimicked our voices. It stood in the woods and observed us as if we were meat. But we didn't say so. They looked about. Harold's truck was located. The flannel was located. The drag marks were discovered. Deeper in the forest, they discovered scuffed ground, broken bush, and indications of disturbance. They were unable to locate Harold. They couldn't locate Ben. A few weeks later, they discovered Ben's jacket ripped and dangling over a limb, as if it had been placed there. No body, no blood, no conclusive answers. When no one is around, people say things. They speculate that he might have fallen through thin ice. Perhaps he ran until he passed out. Perhaps he went lost, and what was left was dispersed by animals. All of those are feasible. Because those explanations allow the world to remain predictable, I can see why people need them. Predictable explanations, however, fail to take the voices into consideration. They don't take into consideration the fact that I heard my name called from the treeine in the dark, when no one was around. Ben's voice outside the window while he lay breathing beneath me is not taken into consideration. A radio spitting out warnings in a voice that didn't belong to any station is not taken into consideration. A sound like Kyle's wife calling him from the woods, far from any road, is not taken into consideration. They also fail to explain Ben's expression in that clearing, as if he had been waiting for authorization to charge in its direction. I've had the toughest problem confessing that last part, since it gives the impression that something had been surrounding Ben long before the cabin, rather than something we just happened to stumble onto. I can't stop thinking back on past exchanges and jokes about being hungry after work. Ben's habit of skipping meals and then binging uncontrollably. The way he described feeling more than just exhausted. He exerted the most effort to make the trip, and how he responded to the notepad, grinning as if the first tracks were evidence. Ben did not invite it. I'm not saying he's not to blame. I'm arguing that hunger isn't always related to food, and those who were out there were more aware of this than we were. I did what I convinced myself was reasonable after it happened. I did my research to find a framework, not to pursue monsters. If you look for voices in the woods, the term Wendigo appears quickly. Mimic tales of hunger and backwoods creatures. However, I didn't discover a tidy monster handbook. Many people, particularly indigenous writers and groups, expressed in various ways that these myths are warnings, that they are connected to actual history rather than just amusement or costumes. Winter, loneliness, greed, and starvation are just a few of the terrible things that can happen to those who let hunger control them. Because it's not a campfire story, some individuals don't even enjoy saying the name. It's a limit. I'm being cautious when I tell you this, because I don't want to take someone else's caution and make it into a source of excitement or pleasure. I'm not claiming anything. I'm only describing what I went through and how it looks when compared to the outdated cautions. We don't return. We never made an effort to complete the journey. The items we left in the cabin were never attempted to be retrieved. Eventually, someone else closed up Harold's house. I'm not sure if it still stands, and I'm not interested in finding out. Shortly after, Jordan left the hospital. Not because of the woods per se, but rather because he couldn't bear the thought of hearing others discuss their suffering as though it were an issue he could resolve. Months later, he once told me that not seeing the monster in the trees is the toughest part. The worst part is that he may have made the only decision that kept the rest of us alive when he decided not to pursue Ben. The word hungry is no longer used casually by Kyle. According to his wife, he has a superstitious habit of keeping protein bars in every drawer and automobile. The world won't turn if he keeps food close at hand. The video that Na had taken at the cabin was erased. She informed me that she could hear the quiet of the woods beneath it, so she couldn't bear the sound of her own laughter. She relocated. It's for school, she explains. I believe it's because she needs various trees. Additionally, I no longer camp in remote areas. I continue to go outside. I continue to go hiking. The silence still appeals to me. However, I avoid places where voices can travel great distances, and it is impossible to determine who spoke first. Sometimes in the middle of the night, when everything is normal, my fridge is humming and my house is silent, I find myself thinking back to the time Ben ran. His body moved as if it had already made up its mind, about that slender, patient figure in the trees that remained unaffected by noise or shooting, regarding how it didn't pursue us when it could have, as if it wasn't necessary. One of us was what it desired. One of us was affected. The fact that Ben wasn't in front of us with his claws and teeth is the coldest part, and it still feels like a stone in my chest. It made use of something simpler. It spoke in the shadows. It made use of a person's desire to respond when called upon. And it made use of hunger, the kind that can't be satisfied by food, the kind that pushes you in the direction of the trees, despite your gut telling you to stay by the fire. I'm writing it this way for that reason. Not as a challenge, not as a myth, and not as evidence of anything. As a record of what transpired when we disregarded the initial cautions because they seemed superstitious and approached the woods more like a place to relax than as a place with ancient laws. If you learn anything from this, it should be something modest and useful. Don't respond if you hear your name in the dark while you're far out in the wilderness. Avoid being courteous. Don't have courage. Don't veer off course to show that you're not afraid. Allow the quiet to endure, because sometimes declining the conversation is the safest course of action. And if you have never experienced genuine hunger, the type that alters your perspective, be thankful and continue to do so. Because whatever was out there by that lake didn't feel like a hungry predator. It seemed to be able to identify a fissure in a person and know just how to gradually and gently deepen it till the person entered the trees by themselves.